Admiral Kextal of the Viari Dominion had seen countless battlefields, from the shattered moons of the Orden conflict to the nebula-choked killing fields of the Vorten expanse. He had commanded fleets that darkened the stars, reduced entire planets to cinders, and rewritten the laws of war with his tactical brilliance. He had fought and won wars before humans had ever set foot beyond their pale blue dot. And yet, here he stood, watching a human child play a game, and feeling a cold, unfamiliar sensation coil in his gut. The simulation unfolded on a large holodisplay inside the human colony's bustling spaceport. Dozens of onlookers, both human and alien, had gathered around the screen, murmuring as the child executed rapid-fire commands. Kextal's initial amusement at the spectacle had quickly turned to curiosity, then to unease. The simulated battle was fast, brutal, and chaotic, nothing like the meticulously disciplined engagements of the Dominion. The child's small hands danced over the interface, issuing orders that should have been foolish. And yet, the enemy fleet was crumbling before his eyes. Kextal crossed his arms, his mandibles twitching. "What is this?" he muttered to his attaché, Commander Vela, who stood at his side. "The humans call it a real-time strategy simulator, Admiral," Vela replied, his voice carefully neutral. "A recreational pastime, nothing more." Kextal's slitted pupils narrowed. Recreational? The battle unfolding on the screen was anything but. The child had just baited an enemy dreadnought into a seemingly vulnerable position, only for a hidden wing of strike craft to emerge from an asteroid field, shredding it with precision missile fire. Moments later, the remaining enemy ships attempted to regroup, only for the child to sacrifice one of his own frigates in a maneuver that forced them into a crossfire. It was calculated. Cold. Perfect. The game's interface pulsed as the simulated battle ended. Victory. The onlookers cheered, patting the boy on the back. The child simply grinned and queued up for the next match. Kextal exhaled slowly. He had seen years of military academy graduates who could not command with such precision. And yet, this was a child, untrained, undisciplined. That should have made his tactics reckless. Instead, they were honed to a razor's edge. He turned to Vela, lowering his voice. "How old is he?" Vela checked his datapad. "Approximately 10 human years, Admiral." Kextal's mandibles twitched again. That was impossible. Tactical genius took decades to cultivate. Military leadership required experience, years of study, careful refinement. It was not something a child could pick up casually. And yet, this boy had just outmaneuvered an AI that had likely been programmed with years of real battle data. Perhaps it is merely an anomaly, Vela suggested, sensing his superior's unease. Kextal wanted to believe that. But his instincts, honed over a lifetime of war, whispered otherwise. He looked around at the spaceport, at the humans moving about their daily lives. How many more of them had played this game? How many had unknowingly trained themselves in the art of war? A shadow fell over him as another human approached. This one was an adult, a man dressed in a crisp uniform, insignia marking him as part of Earth's defense forces. "Impressive, isn't it?" the officer said, his voice casual, but his eyes sharp. Kextal straightened, clasping his hands behind his back. "For a child's game? Perhaps." The officer chuckled. "You'd be surprised. These games aren't just for fun. They're designed to refine strategy, test theories, simulate real engagements. Some of our best tacticians cut their teeth on them before they ever stepped foot in a command center." Kextal stared at him, the weight of those words sinking in. Before he could respond, the officer gestured toward the screen. "He's using one of our classified fleet doctrines. The kind that's restricted to active duty personnel." Kextal stiffened. His blood ran cold. The officer smiled. "Funny thing about humans, Admiral. We like to play games." Kextal did not return the smile. Because, for the first time in his long, decorated career, he realized he might have just witnessed the future of warfare, and humanity had already mastered it. Admiral Kextal had fought 100 battles across the stars, but he had never once lost to an enemy that did not exist. Yet here he was, staring at a simple holoscreen, watching as a mere game dismantled him piece by piece. The child had stepped away after his victory, but Kextal had insisted on trying the simulator himself. He had expected to crush the AI opponent. How could a simple human entertainment system match the tactical mind of a Dominion War Admiral? And yet, in less than 10 minutes, he was losing. Badly. The enemy fleet adjusted to his movements with impossible speed. His forces moved in precise, textbook formations, but the AI adapted instantly, exploiting weaknesses he hadn't even considered. Every attempt to reposition was met with aggressive countermaneuvers, ambushes, and feints that made no sense, and yet worked. His fleet dwindled under relentless assaults. His battleships, models of Dominion tactical discipline, were outflanked by chaotic, hyper-aggressive human tactics. Ships sacrificed themselves strategically, drawing his fire just long enough for the real attack to hit where he least expected. It was frustrating. It was infuriating. It was effective. The simulation blinked in red. Defeat. A few human bystanders chuckled softly, not in mockery, but in recognition, like they had seen this before. Like they had expected it. Kextal exhaled, mandibles twitching. He had never lost a battle so thoroughly. He turned to Commander Vela, who had watched the match in stunned silence. This is not just a game. No, Admiral, Vela agreed, his voice low. It is not. The human officer from earlier stepped forward, arms crossed. It's based on real fleet combat simulations, he said, nodding toward the screen. Millions of players testing scenarios, refining strategies, pushing our doctrine to the limits. Every battle fought here feeds into something greater. Kextal clenched his jaw. You are telling me that your military, your people, have been refining combat strategy through civilian entertainment? The officer smirked. Why wouldn't we? War is just a game of numbers, probabilities, and human ingenuity. Might as well give the whole species a chance to play. Kextal stared at him, horrified. The implications were staggering. If this was the level of strategy being developed by children and amateurs, what did that mean for Earth's actual military? What did that mean for the Dominion's carefully trained, rigidly disciplined fleets? His mind raced. He had always assumed the Dominion held technological and strategic superiority over humanity. They had studied human war records, observed their limited interstellar conflicts. By Dominion standards, humanity was undisciplined, reckless, tactically immature. But now, he saw the truth. Humanity had never stopped fighting. Even in peacetime, they had been preparing. Refining their tactics in secret, disguising them as games, entertainment, casual hobbies. A culture that raised its young to think creatively, tactically, relentlessly, and all without the restrictions of military dogma. It was insidious. It was genius. It was terrifying. The officer watched Kextal carefully. You look troubled, Admiral. I am, Kextal admitted, his voice quieter than he intended. He had spent decades mastering strategy, believing himself to be among the greatest tacticians in the known galaxy. And yet, in the span of 1 hour, he had been humbled by a human child playing a game. The realization settled over him like a weight. His people had always believed war was an exact science, a predictable equation of firepower, positioning, and discipline. But humanity did not see war that way. They saw it as a puzzle to be solved, a problem to be gamed, a challenge to be won. That made them the most dangerous kind of opponent. Kextal turned to Vela, his voice measured. Find out where this simulator originates. Who built it? Who designed it? Vela nodded and immediately started searching his datapad. The human officer's smirk didn't fade. You're asking the wrong questions, Admiral. Kextal frowned. And what should I be asking? The officer leaned in slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. You should be asking how many other games we've made, and what they've been training us for. Admiral Kextal was not a creature easily unsettled, but something about this was wrong. He stood rigidly beside Commander Vela, watching a stream of data scroll across the hollow display. The human officer had granted them limited access to the simulator's match records, and what Kextal saw defied belief. Millions, no, billions, of recorded battles. Tactical maneuvers ranging from textbook formations to wild, unorthodox strategies that no sane war doctrine would approve. Fleets engaging in suicidal feints that somehow turned into victories. Civilian players, young and old, refining tactics against an AI opponent that learned and evolved in real time. This data is, Vela hesitated, struggling for words. It's too much. Kextal didn't respond immediately. His eyes traced the movements of a recorded battle, a human player versus the AI, a match labeled simply as Final Stand, Scenario 214. The scenario was terrifyingly realistic. A lone human fleet, outnumbered 20-1, stood against the simulated Tron War Armada, a species the Dominion considered the greatest martial force in the known galaxy. The human player had no chance of victory. And yet, they won. Not through superior firepower. Not through sheer force of will. But through something else entirely. The human commander used false retreats, unpredictable maneuvers, and overlapping kill zones to break apart the enemy formation piece by piece. The Tron fleet, simulated with actual war data, had followed logical responses. But logic had no place on this battlefield. The humans' erratic, unpredictable choices forced the AI into errors. The fleet lured enemy warships into crossfire traps. It baited capital ships into wasting ordnance, only to strike when they were exposed. Within 20 minutes, the entire Tron fleet was annihilated. Kextal's throat tightened. His mandibles twitched. It was just a game, and yet, it was not. The Tron were one of the most feared military forces in the galaxy. Their real fleets would have reacted almost identically to this simulation. If a single human player had outmaneuvered them here, then what would happen if? Kextal exhaled slowly. He already knew the answer. The Tron would lose. The Dominion had always considered humans too reckless to be true strategists, but that recklessness was not carelessness. It was weaponized unpredictability. A doctrine that no enemy could counter because it had no pattern to follow. He turned to Vela. This simulator, it adapts to real battle data? Vela nodded, his skin pale under the dim light. It's worse than that, Admiral. It doesn't just adapt. It evolves. Kextal frowned. Explain. Vela hesitated, then displayed another match. A player versus player battle, two high-ranking human participants. The combat was faster, more ruthless, and more complex than anything Kextal had seen. They don't just play against AI, Vela said. They play against each other. The best minds in their species constantly test themselves. Every game, every engagement, every unexpected move, it's all refined, adjusted, and then used again. Kextal's hands tightened behind his back. They weren't just training against simulations. They were training against the best strategists their species could produce. His pulse quickened. He had always believed the Dominion had the superior doctrine. The better war machine. The more disciplined officers. But how do you fight an enemy whose very culture is built on refining the art of war, without even realizing they were doing it? The human officer, still watching them, gave a slow nod. You're starting to see it, aren't you? Kextal met his gaze. Yes. He was seeing it. And he did not like what he saw. Admiral Kextal had spent a lifetime mastering the art of war. He had studied ancient battle records, memorized tactical treatises from every major civilization, and commanded fleets that had shaped the course of history. And yet, as he stood in the heart of this human colony, watching children play a game that mirrored the most advanced battle simulations in the galaxy, he felt something unfamiliar slithering into his thoughts. Doubt. How long had humanity been doing this? How many of these games had been played? How many future admirals, strategists, and warlords had been unknowingly trained, while their species called it entertainment? Kextal turned to Vela, his voice tight. You have a report? The commander nodded, his expression grim. Yes, Admiral. And it is, troubling. A new holoscreen flickered to life, displaying a list of human-developed simulators. The number was staggering. Hundreds of thousands. Some were simplistic, designed for casual players. Others were so intricate that they blurred the line between strategy and military doctrine. And then there were the classified ones. Vela tapped a few commands, pulling up restricted data that had been scraped from open networks. Several of these training systems are funded by Earth's Defense Command. Not publicly, of course, but through proxies. They have spent decades cultivating a civilian war culture, Admiral. And it's not just space combat. Another screen flashed. Tactical ground operations. Cyber warfare. Naval engagements. Economic and logistical warfare simulations. Kextal stared. This is impossible. No species would dedicate this much effort to theoretical war. It's not theoretical, Vela said quietly. It's practical. The human officer was watching them again, his expression unreadable. You're starting to see the pattern, aren't you? He asked, his voice almost amused. Kextal exhaled. Explain. The officer clasped his hands behind his back. Humanity is young. Compared to your Dominion, we've barely stepped onto the galactic stage. We don't have your numbers. We don't have your centuries of experience. So we adapted. His eyes gleamed. You see war as a science. Something with fixed rules, predictable outcomes. He gestured toward the screens. We see it as a puzzle. A game. A problem that just needs the right strategy. Kextal resisted the urge to scoff, but the words dug into him. You say that, he murmured, but humans have not fought a true interstellar war. The officer smiled thinly. Haven't we? A new holofile opened. Recorded military engagements. And Kextal saw it. Conflicts against pirate fleets, skirmishes with rogue AI warships, small-scale battles with alien warlords. Humanity had been engaging in real combat for years, testing strategies and live engagements. Each time, they adjusted. Each time, they improved. Each time, they won. His throat tightened. You've been refining your tactics under the guise of defense. The officer nodded. We've been preparing for something inevitable, Admiral. Kextal's mind raced. The Dominion had never considered humans a major military power. They had assumed them to be insignificant, a species still learning to walk among the stars. But that had been a lie. Or rather, a miscalculation. They had never needed a vast navy, never needed to match the Dominion ship for ship. Because humanity had never planned to fight the next war conventionally. They had been training an entire civilization for war without firing a single shot. Kextal looked away from the data. Away from the human officer's knowing expression. For the first time, he felt like he was the one playing catch-up. Admiral Kextal had always believed in the supremacy of the VARA Dominion's war doctrine. It was built on centuries of victories, a foundation of discipline and calculated force projection. The Dominion had shaped the battlefield of the galaxy itself. But as he stood in the dimly lit control center of his personal warship, staring at a real battle unfolding in deep space, he realized something terrifying. The Dominion had been preparing for the wrong kind of war. On the holoscreen before him, a live combat feed streamed directly from the front lines. The Tron Empire, a brutal, warlike race that had conquered entire sectors of space, had launched an unprovoked invasion into human-controlled territory. By all logic, the battle should have been over already. The Tron fleet was massive, an overwhelming force of dreadnoughts, battlecruisers, and planet-crackers designed to wipe entire civilizations from existence. The Dominion had long feared them, avoided direct conflict whenever possible. And yet, they were losing. Badly. Kextal leaned forward, eyes locked on the unfolding chaos. The human fleet, smaller, outnumbered, and technologically inferior, should not have stood a chance. Any traditional engagement would have seen them obliterated. But this was not a traditional engagement. The Tron Armada had advanced in tight, disciplined formations, their war doctrine favoring overwhelming, synchronized assaults. But the humans never fought where they were expected to. They fragmented their fleet into smaller, unpredictable strike groups. Ambush teams lurked in asteroid fields, striking only when critical weak points were exposed. Their ships moved in erratic patterns, using high-speed skirmish tactics that shattered the cohesion of the Tron war machine. Every time the Tron adjusted, the human forces changed their strategy instantly. It was the same thing Kextal had seen in the simulators. The same chaotic, unorthodox thinking. Except this time, it wasn't a game. This time, it was war. And humanity was winning. Kextal's mandibles clenched. He turned to Commander Vela. "What are our intelligence reports saying?" Vela's expression was pale. The Tron expected an easy conquest. They assumed humanity would fight conventionally, use formation tactics, strategic retreats, and numerical advantages. He shook his head. Instead, the humans are using war doctrine they refined in the simulators. The Tron don't know how to counter it. Kextal's eyes flicked back to the battle. A Tron dreadnought, one of the most powerful warships in the galaxy, had been lured into a feint. It moved to intercept what looked like a vulnerable human battleship, only for a squadron of stealth corvettes to ambush it from behind, disabling its engines in a single coordinated strike. Within seconds, a swarm of human bombers closed in, turning the dreadnought into a drifting, burning husk. It was identical to a maneuver he had seen in the simulator. Identical to what that human child had done in a so-called game. The realization sent a chill through his spine. They had trained for this war before it had even begun. Vela looked at him. "Admiral, what do we do?" Kextal didn't answer immediately. He watched the Tron fleet falter, their once impenetrable formations collapsing under the weight of human adaptability. The battle was already decided. And the Dominion had a choice to make. Stay neutral and watch as humanity became the most dominant military force in the galaxy. Or act now, before it was too late. Admiral Kextal had never witnessed a war end so quickly. The Tron fleet, once thought to be an unstoppable force, had been reduced to drifting wreckage in a matter of days. Their grand war machine, built on centuries of brute force and overwhelming firepower, had crumbled against an enemy that never fought fair. Kextal stood in the Dominion's central war chamber, watching the final reports trickle in. Across every front, human forces had executed a perfect strategic dismantling of the Tron war effort. The Tron had expected a battle of attrition. Humanity had given them a masterclass in annihilation instead. The surviving Tron ships had fled, their invasion shattered. And now, the balance of power in the galaxy had shifted. Forever. The Dominion's War Council sat in silence, staring at the battle reports with expressions ranging from disbelief to outright fear. "They fought as if they had done this before," murmured one of the high-ranking strategists. "But this was their first major interstellar war." "No," Kextal said quietly, his mandibles clicking. "It wasn't." The War Council turned toward him. He gestured toward the reports. This war wasn't won on the battlefield. It was won long before the first shot was fired. The room remained silent. Kextal took a slow breath. "We assumed humanity was untested. That they lacked experience. But experience comes in many forms. They trained their people, not in academies, not in controlled military exercises, but in simulations disguised as entertainment. A full generation has grown up playing games that prepared them for this exact war." The weight of his words sank in. Vela, standing nearby, broke the silence. "Admiral, we must consider the implications." "Yes," Kextal murmured. "And those implications are terrifying." Humanity had turned strategy into a game. And by doing so, they had trained millions of potential commanders without anyone realizing it. That was why they had won so decisively. Every child who had ever played those simulators had unknowingly contributed to a war doctrine more refined than anything the galaxy had ever seen. The humans had been preparing for war without ever meaning to. And now, war had come. And they had won effortlessly. One of the Dominion strategists leaned forward, his voice uneasy. "What do we do now?" Kextal didn't answer immediately. He looked down at the datapad, at the final casualty numbers. Humanity's fleet had suffered almost no significant losses. Their victory had been absolute. That meant they weren't just a rising power. They were now the most dangerous force in the galaxy. Kextal looked up, his voice calm, his decision made. "We align with them," he said simply. The room tensed. "Admiral," another strategist protested, "if we align with them, we acknowledge their superiority. We acknowledge that we—" "Yes," Kextal interrupted. "We do." He met their gazes one by one. "And if we do not, then we will be the ones on the wrong side of history." Silence. Then slow, reluctant nods. The Dominion had always believed war was about firepower, discipline, and force. But humanity had rewritten the rules. They had proven that the mind was the greatest weapon of all. As Kextal turned away from the table, he cast one last look at the holoscreen, at the final remnants of the Tron fleet fleeing in terror. And for the first time, he understood the truth. Humanity had never been playing a game. The rest of the galaxy had.